Is our reality a quantum hologram? What if the truth about life after death lies waiting to be discovered in the basement of a haunted house? Are we connected to galactic civilizations? I lie awake at night thinking about these things. I never miss an opportunity to ask bigger questions. Hi, I'm Ron James, and this is another edition of Bigger Questions. Here in the studio with me today is Lisette Larkins. Lisette, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you've had an incredible experience in your life that led to two incredible books, and then you've branched out into covering even broader subjects. So we've got a couple of the books here today, but I understand it's not the entire collection. We've got Above and Beyond, which is the true story of extraterrestrial contact. And then we've got this other one, Difficult People. We'll talk about how you got from here to here shortly. And then your first book.
Talking to Extraterrestrials.
And that was the one that really kind of brought your experience to light for the first time.
Yes. Well, it took a few years to get to the point of writing that book, but eventually I did.
So Lisette, tell us what happened to you.
I was a young mother. I had a young child at home. I was married at the time to a then military officer, although he had just gotten out of the military. And we were having marital problems. We were really, really struggling. And we had this young newborn, and we had a lot of the normal problems that young couples have. Stressors kind of impinging on us from all different areas. And I was struggling with those. And I found myself in my kind of moments of peace, really, praying for help. And what I didn't recognize at the time was that in those moments, I was really calling for answers. I was calling to find a way out. And that's, interestingly enough, when my extraterrestrial contact experiences began. And I think it's because I was floundering to such a degree that I was surrendering to some degree, and I was surrendering, looking for a way out. And the way that extraterrestrials helped me out is kind of a long story and a convoluted one, but ultimately has to do with profound experiences. Kind of breaks open the soul. It breaks open the human brain and allowed me at the time to consider something bigger than myself.
Let's talk about the state of surrender for a moment. You were going through really trying times. Now, did you actually consciously say to the universe, I surrender to this, I'm in your hands, I trust you, or were you in a state of surrender, or did you go through an act of surrender?
I'd say both. I had hit a bottom. I wasn't drinking or doing drugs, I wasn't a smoker, none of that was going on. But I was so lost spiritually. I had complete amnesia, so to speak, as to who I was as a being in the context of what I was here to do, what was the meaning of my life. I just didn't understand any of it. I was heartbroken, I think, because my whole life I was looking for the right mate. And now I had the right mate, or so I thought. And now we had a young family that I wanted for so long, and everything was falling apart. So I was profoundly upset, I was depressed, and so I was surrendering because clearly I didn't know how to get myself to a place of happiness. I didn't know how to get myself to a place of success in my own definition. And of course that definition has changed.
Now, before you had this experience, which we'll go over here in a moment, had you had any interest in the ET phenomenon? Had you had
Zero.
any kind of
Zero.
sci-fi background? Interested in the paranormal? None of that, huh?
No, not only was I not interested in it, but I shared many kind of secret skeptical thoughts like many people do when I would see tabloids in the supermarket or sometimes going to parties and hear people kind of snickering in the corner about somebody who would claim to have. As a child, I did have an interesting experience in which I had some sort of contact experience, but kind of wrote it off as a dream and then forgot about it for the next 30 years, or 20 to 30 years. So I did, looking back, I did have an experience as a 6 or 7 year old. So something happened, and when I then later, as a then 30-year-old, started to have my encounter experiences, I remembered them from when I was a child. Louder and brighter, there was a funnel of light that shot through the ceiling and enveloped me completely. I went to open my mouth to scream, all the while wondering what was happening to my young child in his bed, in his crib. And at that point, my eyes involuntarily closed. And I could feel my body moving. I could feel this electromagnetic sensation. It felt like I was being electrocuted. And I was just traumatized, just frightened beyond description. I could feel my heart beating, pounding in my chest. And then I could feel myself start to lose consciousness. And I couldn't comprehend why that would be, because I was so frightened I didn't expect that I would be losing consciousness at that moment. And then I kind of woke up in the morning, and that started me on a long, long journey.
And so that experience sounds like an energetic type of experience, but there wasn't an actual encounter with a being?
Not that night. There was an encounter. I'm sure, I would imagine that there was an encounter, but that then experience continued 2 or 3 nights a week for the next year, for the next few years, with me trying to figure out what was happening. And it wasn't until for a long time had gone by, and I was trying to figure out if I had lost my mind, if I was going crazy, if the house was haunted, if they were ghosts. There's all this, there's like a laundry list of possibilities. And ultimately, I eventually, after doing some more work, meaning grounding myself, attempting to dissolve some of the trauma, that's when I started to remain awake during the experience. And then I was able to see what was in front of me. Because before this point, I was so traumatized, so frightened, I don't know if I was taking myself out or somebody else was placing me under this kind of a cloud of forgetfulness, or I was just being put to sleep, so to speak. But ultimately, I was awake. And that was the experience that was just mind-boggling.
So during the time that you were having these experiences where you weren't really complete in your perceptions of what was going on, you said it went on for almost a year?
Probably more than that.
Did you seek medical attention?
At the time, my marriage was getting worse and worse, because I was so traumatized. It was happening a few times a week. There were things started to change. I started to change. It was as though a curtain had opened, and I started to have second sight. And what I mean by that is I started to have these experiences where I saw these in the middle of the strangest places, in the grocery store. I would see these snippets of videos of future events. I started to hear people's thoughts. I started to have everything in the house would have a reaction as I would walk by it. So as I would walk by a lamp, it would go on and off. So I recognized that something electromagnetically was happening as a result of my experiences, and it would impact the machines in the house. And so this went on, and I started to feel more and more out of control. My then husband felt that there was something wrong with me. I would tell him a little bit, but not everything, because I was afraid that somebody would perceive me as crazy. So eventually, it was actually his suggestion that we admit me to a psychiatric hospital. And that's exactly what we did. One night, we'd had a terrible argument. He drove me to the doors of a psychiatric hospital and said, "Sweetheart, let's get you some help. Let's check you in. I'll be back in the morning with some clothes." And the next morning, I was served with divorce papers, and that started me on the journey for real to explore what was happening to me.
Now, did you see this coming at all? Did you see this coming at all? Did you have any idea that he was going to do that?
No, I didn't. I should have, I guess. But, I now look at it from his perspective, because he, if you think I was confused, imagine how confused he was. And so he was just concerned for our son's safety. He went right to a judge and said, my wife is crazy. She's crying. She thinks something's happening to her in the middle of the night. Nobody else can see it except her. And so there I am in a psychiatric hospital, having lost custody of my child, having been served divorce papers. And I really realized then that I'm in a real bad situation right now. In those days, a husband could close down your checking account and take all your money out. So I had no access to money. Of course, friends weren't popping in. I was in there, and I was locked in there. It was a real serious situation. And so my only resource was to find a spiritual answer. And interestingly, I had another experience in the hospital, while I was in the hospital, and I realized that I needed to get out of the hospital. And so even though I was in there for 3 weeks and I had a team of clinicians, I had not yet been given any medication, fortunately. Finally, in my book, I describe how I was able to kind of get myself out of there, but I was able to get out, and ultimately I regained custody of my son, and then started the slow, long journey of, well, then what was happening to me? But it didn't happen overnight. First, I embarked on a 6-year journey with a psychotherapist and a team of clinicians outside of the hospital setting, in which I submitted to both individual and group clinical, psychiatric, and psychological evaluation, because I really wanted to know if maybe I was crazy. And having grown up in Los Angeles, I thought, you know what, I can take a pill for this, whatever I have. If I have something, I can just medicate me then, if that's the answer. So I wanted to know, and I really did want to know. And after this 6 long years of this process, and the clinician ended up actually being a contributor to my first book, Talking to Extraterrestrials, in which he writes the appendix explaining from a clinician standpoint the kind of trauma that a person can go through if they're not indeed crazy, but they're having these experiences that make them feel like they're going crazy. So having been now told that I was of sound mind, I felt less trauma. And as soon as that happened, the experiences started up again after a hiatus, but this time I was wide awake. And this time I was able to really perceive what was happening. Then I actually was beholding these small gray beings that we refer to as aliens or extraterrestrials. And the telepathic conversation continued while I was in a conscious state. And many of those conversations became what was my first book.
So they shared certain information with you?
Yes, but not the kind of information that people want. We as human beings, we want to know, we want concrete information. When are the aliens going to land on the White House lawn? When are we going to, wake up? When are we going to find the answer to free energy? But
I'd be happy with lottery numbers. I'm not asking for that much.
That's right. It's truly true. And so this has been a long process, but what I started to glean was that this gift that we've been given as incarnating as a human being is with our full cooperation. And part of the process is just that. It is the not knowing and yet discovering. It's the process of discovering who we are in the face and the context of great, seemingly insurmountable problems, upsets, and turmoil.
I say that a lot, I suspect that our purpose here and our journey here is that we purposely make ourselves deaf, dumb, and blind. We forget who we are, and it's our mission in this illusionary reality to puzzle our way out of the matrix.
Yes, as it were, yes. That's what this Earth experience is. It's coming in with no memory. It's coming in with full amnesia. It's agreeing to participate in the game, which is that, and it's a strange set of rules, But from my understanding, what the rule book is, it has been known, and it's not just it's not just planet Earth from what I understand. It's all places where beings are incarnating in order to awaken, spiritually speaking. But that it's through the process of wrongdoing, experiencing wrongdoing in all of its forms. And we can name,
Sure.
dozens and dozens of different ways that we experience wrongdoing, whether we're born handicapped or become so, whether we have incurable illnesses, or, and on and on and on. I mean, how will we grow and move through that? And suicide is never an option, because if suicide were an option, we wouldn't have the paradigm that we have. But suicide is never an option. So, yes, it's this process that it has been discovered that the way that a being is most efficiently grown into an evolved being is through struggling through adversity and coming out of it whole and trained, and kind of like the Olympic athlete, they put themselves through a training. Well, Earth is that training.
That makes perfect sense. I have this sense that as we evolve as spiritual beings, that to truly become a autonomous part of the collective whole of consciousness, that we have to be in a situation where we've evolved ourselves to the point where we don't bring chaos to consciousness. So in other words, the best place to put evolving spirits is in a harmless sandbox where they can learn, because you can't just let a brand new autonomous consciousness into the collective, because it will always be chaos. It's probably where the original good and evil came from. It's probably the whole purpose of this training and this life is to give us this place to grow up, because we can't just barge into the collective consciousness without causing tremors.
Right, and there are many places to grow up. There are many different places to evolve. This particular one is considered to be the most rigorous. One of the most rigorous, if not the most rigorous, and it's because we don't just have physical challenges. We also have mental, emotional challenges. There are many places that only have one of them. And many of us start on those places that only have one. And then we, if we so choose, we want to really move over to the Marine boot camp, we come to Earth. And this is the place to be for serious students of spirituality. And even young souls who are assigned here through their own agreement, even though they haven't yet experienced much training, here they are, and here we are, which is why we have so much chaos here, because if you take a planetary population that is growing so quickly, and you have, say, 70, 80% of the population currently in the early stages of their program, what do you think that's going to look like? It's going to look like a sandbox with kids throwing sand at each other. And so that's why it's so challenging, is because we're all in different levels of attainment, and we're all mixed up together, and as the population increases, you can imagine everything is just tenfold crazier. There's just more and more chaos. One can't escape it, whether it's your family of origin, your in-laws, your neighbors, your school, your employment. It's everywhere. And of course, that's how I got to my other book, which is Difficult People. We're all dealing with chaos from one end of it to the other end. And so how do we overcome it? How do we grow through it? And part of, for me, why aliens, why ET contact, that to me is the most precious part of extraterrestrial contact phenomena, is what is there to learn from it?
So as we bring the nature of spirituality, the nature of the soul's journey into the conversation, that these facts were revealed to you by traditional extraterrestrial presences, how do we reconcile those things? Because a lot of people say that the extraterrestrial presence is not benevolent. A lot of people say that the extraterrestrial presence is not working in our highest and best good. A lot of the knowledge that you seem to have been given from these encounters is very advanced spiritual knowledge. But then there's people that say, we're being raised as property, food, fear, harvesting, you know, all kinds of other very nefarious things that are
Right.
supposedly going on. So how do we make all this kind of gel together?
Well, we can't unless we begin to recognize the nature of our immortal soul. And that, to me, is the only point of contact in my case. For me, it wasn't until I started to understand and comprehend, never mind how I was able to do it, I have no clue how I was able to do it, but I started to have experiences where I was visiting and remembering having visited the interlife, the life between lives. And when I was able to witness the life between lives, in the same way that people who have reported having near-death experiences do, although I didn't have any physiological or physical illness to get me there as a technical near-death experience, nonetheless, I was having these profound extraterrestrial contact experiences. And in the same encounter experience within it, I was traveling to the interlife. So even though I had face-to-face physical extraterrestrial contact experiences, somehow in those I would also have these experiences where my soul was going to the interlife, and I was remembering, I was seeing, I was experiencing what we all do when we're there between lives. And as soon as I recaptured that memory and started to see what we're all up to, then everything makes perfect sense, including the fact that it's almost irrelevant, all of the different opinions about what's going on here and why. To me, the only thing that matters is if we as individuals recognize who we are as immortal spiritual beings. Because if one recognizes oneself as immortal and recognizes that we're constantly incarnating in order to grow, the package that we show up in at birth and live through, it can be anywhere. It can be, there's multitude of scenarios in which we place ourselves. So in the same way that some people are grown up with, some little babies have crack addicts as parents, and other children are born into great wealth with great educational experiences in their future, and everything is given to them. So, but it's all happening in the same context of, say, pick one city, Los Angeles, right? So you've got some children growing up into great wealth with seemingly every opportunity, and in the same city you've got great tragedy, poverty, sexual abuse, and it's all mixed up there together. You also, of course, have people grown into great wealth who are experiencing great trauma and tragedy. So it's so interesting to me because here we are, we know that the incarnated experience is full of challenges. So why would we expect that there are not a variation of levels of spiritual attainment, which would mean that there's all of it going down? There's everything happening all at once. And that looks like anything that you want to name. So it's an umbrella of recognition that really covers any possible scenario that you can name. So whether it's we're being harvested, or whether we're being mind controlled, or whether there's the Illuminati, or whether aliens are evil, or whether I know the friendly ones, ultimately, look, the truth is, just, you know, I've lived in a house where the neighbor to my right seemed to be the incarnation of evil itself, right? This is my next door neighbor. And yet, the next house I moved to has, I become best friends, you know, for all eternity with this friend, with my next neighbor. So what the heck is going on? It means we're going to get the result of the characteristics that people exude and demonstrate just reflect on their level of development, right? So we have that cornucopia of experience. So that's what we're going to get. It shouldn't be surprising to us. The problem is that it is surprising to us. And it maims us emotionally and spiritually when we attempt to behold all of the challenges that we're trying to deal with, whether it's ISIS or the Illuminati or the evil aliens, or, you know, ultimately, when people say to me, how can you think the aliens are friendly when this group of people insist that they're evil? Look, we've got human beings who run the gamut of spiritual expression. So we've also got other beings who do the same. It shouldn't be a big surprise to us. It's all going on. The question is, what do you do? How will you behave? How will you go through? How will you overcome those people, beings, that you meet and are confronted with who are nefarious in your own estimation? Because we can all do well when we meet people that we love, right? But that doesn't test us. It only inspires us. But it doesn't really test us.
What you're saying is very profound, and it surprises me the more people don't get it. We find people that get caught up in these different beliefs about what's happening with our reality. Sure, okay, so there's a evil, nefarious group that's running the entire planet, and we're all being raised by reptilians for food, or whatever, right? There's all of these different things, and they may all very well be true, and they may all very well not be true. And the fact of the matter is that in this reality, the nature of truth is just as fluid as anything else, from what I've been able to glean and what I personally believe. And so getting caught up in those things is really missing the whole point, that no matter what it is that we think we're seeing that's happening here in this place, it's happening inside of an energetic framework that is an illusionary program, and it is not the bigger picture. And so I hear what you're saying, in that you're saying, yeah, all of that stuff may be true, so what? Right. And that it doesn't really matter. What matters is our reaction and our perception within it.
And we can all know what we're working on. All we got to do is individually look at what is difficult for us and what nightmare we're trying to cope with. That's the thing that we're trying to grow through. And so, yeah, I mean, we can all categorize all the different levels of wrongdoing. I like to call it wrongdoing. All the different levels of wrongdoing. And yet ultimately we're still left with the fact that we'll be here for 100 and so many years or less, and we've got to make the best of it, and we've got to do something with it, because we exit at that point. And then we go to the interlife, where it all makes sense. Now, we don't become omniscient at death when we pass into the interlife.
Because the interlife, we're still relatively unevolved spiritual beings. We don't have, as you said, we don't have the awareness or the knowledge or the understanding of God, for instance. Somebody told me once, a psychic medium said, well, Ron, just because you're dead, it doesn't mean you're enlightened. And so the interlife, tell us about what that state is like, what you've seen of that state.
Yes, I'm sorry to be so boring, but it is consistent with so much of the literature on near-death experiences. From what I've seen, it's we working in tight-knit groups of souls who we evolve with through our entire, humanity, our entire immortal life. And so we have our initial incarnations with our group, and we continue to do so until we are, moved way forward into our attainment. But when we die, of course, we immediately or soon after immediately retain our consciousness with respect to who we are as beings. And, oh, that's right, now I'm going to go to that wonderful place again. I'm dead now. And people who don't have that recognition are usually very young souls who are so confused, and they often stay for a while, and we call those ghosts, right? But when we then move deeper into the spirit world, and we meet with our spiritual guide, we do a life review, as has been written about for a long time. We get back with our spiritual group, and we review, and we study, and it's like a videotape in minute detail. We go through our life. Imagine hitting the rewind button with our group and going through it and analyzing it and talking about it and role-playing about it and looking, now if I had done that, and now so one is observing themselves in that lifetime, just having come from where we look at ourselves and our behavior. The only difference is that when we are now just an immortal being without our body, we're no longer encumbered by the human brain. And when that happens, we have a little more understanding of our own deficits that we had been working on in that life, which is why we chose the parents that we chose, the siblings that we chose, the spouses that we chose, the employers, all the difficult people that were right in our face, that were driving us insane, because they were there in order to squeeze us, in order to get us into a corner which would provoke our own character deficits so we could see them. So all we're trying to do is see them while we're in a human form, meaning the spiritual mind has now merged with the human brain when we're a human being, and we're wanting to see them. So it's kind of like the person who's suffering from addictions, alcohol or drugs. They go through this denial period, and then if they're lucky, they either hit a bottom and they break their denial and they get into rehab and they start to rebuild their life. But you know, the key is to be able to see themselves and what their deficits are, and that they're actually an addict, that their life has become out of control. And so that's the process that we're going through. And from the perspective of the interlife, if we're still in the early stages of our program, then we are reviewing a life. We're looking at and identifying some of the areas in which we want to grow. But if we're further along in our program, we just have more memory and a more understanding of what is really at stake and what we're really trying to do. So more evolved souls may pick bodies that they may accept no healthy body. They may only choose handicapped bodies. They may only choose to come in with some kind of situation in which they are shunned by society, homosexuality. Those kinds of inducements to be pressured into searching inside, you know, these are all pre-planned. What also happens is when we're in the early stages of our program, sometimes we usually take one sex or the other, one gender or the other for the early stage of our program until we even that out through multiple incarnations. But the very first time that we come in with the opposite gender that we haven't experienced before, it's very uncomfortable, and we just want to be in the other gender that's more comfortable. And so you have people who are feeling more comfortable in the gender of their previous incarnations. So you have both of those things going on. You have people who are voluntarily signing up to be and experience the discrimination in order to feel being ridiculed by society. I mean, it's a huge growth opportunity.
So there's purposes to a lot of these conditions and human conditions that we don't as a society perceive and acknowledge, and that even people in those conditions with their limited scope don't really understand why they're there, but they serve a higher purpose.
Yes, and until, you know, in order to be able to get that perspective, is to be able to consciously recognize that every hour of one's life, one is being, we are retaining, ultimately, we'll have retained a video transcription, if you will, of that experience, and we'll be going over it again later. So whenever we're at the crossroads of what, should I go left or should I go right, or should I act this way or act that way, imagine seeing oneself in a video, because we will, I'm calling it a video, but I don't know how the technology works, but we're actually going to be presented with the past experience of being at a crossroads, making a decision and having made a decision, and was that the wisest choice for that moment? Because what we're evaluated on is our interpretation of events, our interpretation of our conundrums and of our experiences and the decisions that we've made as a basis for those interpretations.
Let's take a moment right there and talk about free will versus the illusion of free will. I've come to kind of think that we have a certain amount of free will at key points of our lives, and then there are certain elements of the program that we're literally on a set of rail tracks, because it seems very difficult to run a program with this many 7 billion people all doing different things. It's almost mathematically impossible for it to work in concert unless it's pre-programmed to some extent. So when you look at the fact that reality does seem to be operating as a program would operate, there has to be a certain amount of predetermined occurrences in order for it to work. Unless there's some way of making it happen that is so far beyond our ability to comprehend that even our best computer programmer couldn't even perceive it. So I've come to theorize that perhaps we have, a lot of times we always have the illusion of free will, and most of the time we're simply living out the results of our choices on a predetermined course. And then at key points in our life, we have genuine free will where we make a key determination that determines, like when you're in a video game, you determine whether you're going to stay on the ship or get off the ship. That's a key point. But if you stay on the ship, the video game is going to play, okay, you chose this is what you're going to get. So where do you find the demarcations of free will versus the illusion of free will?
Yes, and it's particularly interesting when we talk about this in the context of the law of attraction, because we've got we're all in general understanding that we're wanting to be positive in our outlooks, and yet what about the law of attraction? It's so interesting because that's right, we're looking at everything from the perspective of our understanding in this moment. So because we're not benefited by our memories as an immortal being, we forget, we don't know. I might not remember that one of the things that I wanted to experience in this lifetime was how to stand up for myself. Well, how can I learn to stand up for myself unless I'm squashed first? So it really does become a philosophical mystery when we think about setting oneself up to grow means that certain things will be set up by the soul in conjunction with our wise counsel, in which maybe I chose to be born into an alcoholic father. Maybe I chose this difficulty, and we know that if we have an alcoholic male parent, there's a good chance that there might also be, or an uncle or a close family member who's a male, and there's addiction. We know that there's a good chance we're going to be sexually molested, right? So it's such an interesting thing to hold in one's consciousness, where we're going to be compassionate and helpful to victims, and at the same time to understand that the soul sets up for itself, not necessarily always as a karmic punishment, but is something to experience in order to develop a certain aspect of self. So when I look back at my life, and I look at who I was as a young woman, I mean, if you came up to me and said, boo, I'd be trembling. I just didn't seem to have any self-confidence. I was really almost without backbone. And yet, I don't recognize that woman today, but that's because there was decade after decade after decade of situations in which I found myself in a place where I had to learn to stand up for myself. Now, like I said, how can I do that unless I'm in certain situations of wrongdoing? Okay, put me in a psychiatric hospital against my will. Am I going to kill myself? Am I going to give up? Or what am I going to do? And so if I went to a psychic, let's just say I'm 2 weeks before I'm going to a psychiatric hospital, and I go to a psychic, and the psychic says, you better be careful, I see you going into a psychiatric hospital, right? We assume, of course, that the psychic's role is to have us avoid that event. But supposing that's the only event that will help me really to break through the barriers of understanding what it means to be self-reliant. So yes, I think it does take a certain amount of experience to be able to hold two things in consciousness at the same time. That there's a certain amount of pre-planning that goes on, and yet, and that pre-planning sets up these infinitesimal important crossroads. And when those crossroads come, will she go left or will she go right? Will she get into the psychiatric hospital and kill herself? Will she be so suicidal that she'll take her own life, which is an abject failure? I just come back and do it again. And by the way, supposing in my previous life or lifetimes, I have been in a similar situation in which I was entrapped, cornered, tortured, whatever, and let's say I did kill myself. Maybe this is something that I wanted to overcome. And so let's just say I have a predisposition for suicide. I'm going to deliberately set myself up to test that muscle. And that one point of growth is often escapes us, is that we set ourselves up to test our abilities at overcoming, particularly if it's something that we've been working on for eons and that we now say that we've mastered. Well, that is the test. The test is to behold these excruciatingly difficult situations, and will they do this or will they do that? Will they become, so will they wrong somebody else in their process, or will they rise above it and still have compassion for humanity? I mean, these are all the mistakes and choices we're all making constantly.
So, were you very spiritual before this stuff started happening to you?
I don't know. I believe I was a kind person, but when I look back on my youth, I just remember, I was a young girl, I was a teenager, I just loathed myself. I didn't understand what the point of it all was. I was frightened. I had things in my life that I loved. I loved my horses. I loved being in the ocean. There were things that I loved, but I was confused. So I don't think I was a spiritual person, no. I think I was lost.
So we have these occurrences that started happening to you during a low point in your life. It culminated in the awareness of direct contact with what appeared to be extraterrestrial beings, and it imparted in you a pretty extensive, very advanced, and what resonates with me is a largely solid spiritual viewpoint on what's going on with our existence. So there's obviously something very tangible, in my opinion, to your story and to what happened to you. The fact that the extraterrestrial element plays into it is very interesting, because it seems to be a synergy where you don't often find synergies. You don't often find grays in people's experiences really imparting that kind of knowledge to people about life and afterlife. It's quite often completely the opposite. It's more about terrestrial and extraterrestrial affairs and what's going to happen on the planet. It's not often a deep, eternal spiritual conversation or set of revelations. So that's very interesting.
Well, in my opinion, it's almost, having had extraterrestrial encounters is practically at this point irrelevant to me.
Right.
Because it only matters what is the vehicle that one uses to get themselves to expose to themselves their own deficits. And ultimately that was the vehicle that got me to be able to look and see the deficits that were now exposed to me. Hey, when you're in a psychiatric hospital, you see your deficits. How did I get myself in here? What did I do? It wasn't just having contact experiences. I couldn't stand up for myself. I had no confidence in my own perceptions, and on and on and on.
Well, see, this is what fascinates me and intrigues me so much about your story, is it's exactly what you just said. It doesn't matter what the vehicle is, it's the end result. And your end result seems to be that you went from a place of not being a really particularly spiritual person all the way to really having some very advanced understandings and having seen some elements of the afterlife and other elements of our spiritual existence that people talk about and are generally regarded as commonalities among experience. So what's fascinating is your journey there and the fact that you arrived where you arrived. And then I think the last time we heard you speak was when we were shooting the Transcending Reality show, and you talked about having seen some visions of the future. Is that correct?
Well, particularly in the early days, I saw visions of my future. And so right now, I can't offer any visions of our future as a species.
So there was the encounter that you had where you were being shown things. And
the interlife, you mean?
The interlife and
yeah,
and different
many
elements.
times, yes.
So was there a technology that was being used to do this? Was it telepathic? What was it that was enabling these images to come to your perception?
It's the same technology that is being used when we do actually die and we're now spiritual beings in this other realm, in this other dimension, this dimension, the place of the spirit. in which we're able to review a past life as almost a video and even experience what would have been the difference had we made a different choice.
So when you say almost a video, is it you're a formless being, you're an energetic being at this point, you don't have a body?
Well, actually, that's not actually even accurate, because even though we don't have bodies, we can take on a body. It's not, you can't touch it, but we often...
So it's an ethereal body?
Yes, so that we can present ourselves to others in a body that we might want to show ourselves as. Does that make any sense? So
yeah, so it's not the physical flesh and blood like we think of, but
let's say you and I both die in a car accident. We walk out there and we're dead in a car accident, and now we're both in the interlife in a week's time. There's no time, but let's just say it's a week's time. And I, as a spiritual being, pass you. I'm immediately going to put on the clothes that I had in this moment, so you recognize me.
Sure.
And you'll be wearing that. It's like, oh yeah, how's it going? You might even put yourself in this setting.
So what is the mechanism that the images are delivered? Is it, do you see it with ethereal eyes? Do you just perceive it in a telepathic way? Are you like literally sitting in?
Yes. I'm in an environment like this. It's real, and I can't describe how it happens any more than I can. Having had, I don't know how it worked where I'm being transported to these different dimensions. I don't know how that works either. And frankly, I stopped attempting to try to explain it. I have no clue how it happens. And it's interesting because that's where earth science objects. Well, you can't explain it and it can't have happened. And yet we all know that we somehow die, our spiritual body leaves the human body, and we go to this other place, and we don't know how that works either.
Well, I think that there was an episode of Star Trek one time where Captain Janeway was on Earth. She'd gone back in time, and she ran into Leonardo da Vinci, and he was begging her to explain what was a starship and how did it work. And she said to him something that really resonated with me, and that was, you cannot explain to a bird how to ride a horse or paint a picture or build a house. Right. The bird is an intelligent being. It functions in its reality. It just does not have the ability to comprehend something that broad and that vast, and that is why I cannot explain it to you. And so a lot of times we reach these questions as like, well, who's God? Well, where did God come from? Well, where did the collective consciousness come from? What was there before that? There is an answer to these questions, I believe, but I'm not sure that we as human beings with our limited bandwidth and our little brains are actually capable of comprehending the scope of that. And so it's okay to say, I can get my understandings of my spiritual reasoning to a certain point, but I do inevitably reach a point where I just have to say, well, I don't know past there, and that's okay.
And I would like to add one thing to that, which is that even in the spirit world, when we're immortal beings, we can't just ask any question we want and expect to get an answer of our wise elders, because some things are not to be known. If it were known, there would be no test. So for example, if we're deciding where we want to be born to, the family, the city, what career path we want to take on, who we're going to be born to, what do we want as our skill set to be based on who we're born into. Well, we may see snippets of the life that's to come in order to help us choose. That's what we get to do, right? We don't see every act of every part of the play. We're only shown certain things, and from those scenes, we make a choice as to which life we want to take. Well, how is that possible to choose that when the person hasn't even lived the life yet? It's crazy, right?
Right.
How am I choosing, oh, there I am,
well, it's a computer game. It works
right.
the same way.
But there's certain things that are predicted, if you will. Certain things are known, but not all things are we allowed to know. So even if we can, as more evolved beings, let's just say one is in the advanced levels of attainment, and we know people who on Earth right now who are advanced levels of attainment. We know how they act. People like Mother Teresa, right? Accumulation means nothing to her, just being of service. And so if she were to die, well, she did die, but now she's in the spirit world, it doesn't mean that even she has access to all the secrets of the universe. She can't just go up to her wise counsel and say, I want to know exactly what God looks like, or I want to know, or I want to know exactly how my next life is going to go, and all. She's not even going to be privy to that in its entirety. So even if we have the ability to know, we're still incarnating, and so we're not going to be able to know.
Well, many people think there's different levels of, we're down here in the physical, and there's several levels that we have to advance through to really get to those answers. And so it's understandable what you just said. So let's move on to your other book, your last book, Difficult People,
Yes.
where you've actually taken a lot of this knowledge and put it into a form and into an offering where people can really learn, help with their own challenges in their lives, and do a lot of self-development and understanding and compassion for other people. Tell us about Difficult People.
It was a book that I wrote because I was in a very, difficult environment.
This is the book, by the way.
I was with a woman, caring for a woman who had Alzheimer's. And she, in her late stage, even in her early stage, she didn't like me. And yet I was in charge of her. I was caring for her. And so it was so difficult on so many different levels. So how was I going to succeed, meaning the definition of success, meaning that I wasn't going to live my life in anger, fury, and resentment. And so the opportunity presented itself that in this very difficult environment, with this very difficult person who didn't like me, and yet I was responsible for her in many cases, how was I going to be able to feel at one with myself? How was I going to do that around a very difficult person? And even though she is no longer alive, she's since transitioned, and she came to love me, and I love her. Every day, every other day, I still am presented with people in my life who are very difficult, and they may dislike me vehemently. And so this is a common problem, right? So how am I going to not allow myself to be just lost to the problem of it? And so there's nothing new insofar as applying spiritual technique. There are many spiritual wisdom traditions that describe those techniques, and I do so also. Some of those techniques were developed by Eckhart Tolle, and he described techniques that were also used, by Buddhists a long time before him. It really is helpful to put our attention off of the craziness and onto the breath, taking deep breaths, taking one's attention away from the insanity out there and bringing it to the breath, which allows us to focus on this energy, this spiritual energy that we are part of, that's part of us. And by so doing, it just slows down the mind, the busyness, the craziness of the mind, who's offended and upset and disgruntled by the madness. And it's just a practice that I became proficient at because I felt that I had to. And I still practice that all the time. Even, last night, lying in bed, thinking of a very difficult conundrum that I'm in, and allowing myself to still find some peace in it anyway.
So, are the difficult people in your lives your greatest mirror?
Yes, because they invoke my deficits. That's their nature. That's their purpose.
Now, is there a wisdom to say that the more difficult a person is in your life, the greater lesson there is to be learned? Or is there a lot to be said for the more difficult a person is in your life, the faster you should get them out of your life?
That's such a great question, because the interpretation of that problem and the way that it's handled is the test. So there can't be a right or wrong answer to that, but the evaluation, the careful evaluation of that conundrum is itself the examination. That is itself the master's degree.
I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about so many things.
I know, when we think about it, it's like, it's easy for us to refuse to become involved in interpersonal relationships because we know that they're messy. They're always messy. So for those spiritual teachers who have gone into deep retreat and who are living on a mountain or in an ashram or on an island, and they're having little to do with others, there's no challenge there, and there's virtually zero growth.
Right.
And it's a cop-out.
Now, would you say the same thing to those who choose to spend countless hours in deep meditation in a cave somewhere.
I'm including that as part of the paradigm. Yes. That's a cop-out. And when they do their evaluation, you know, they may likely see what a waste of time that was.
I've always, you know, I'm not going to say anything disparaging to people that spend a lot of time meditating. I think it's a great practice and I think it has its place. I think that some people take it to a little bit of an extreme, and, you know, while you're here walking around with, you know, most of us 10 toes and 10 fingers and in the human body, I believe in embracing the human experience. And so it's very, very difficult to do that if you're seeking other experiences elsewhere and missing where you're not now. So it's almost like defeating the purpose of being here is to be in a constant state of trying to escape or deny the human condition.
Yes, because withdrawing is not it. Withdrawing and finding a honorable way to contextualize it is just a cop-out. You know, imagine a prize-fighting, you know, boxer. He's in the ring. Yes, he takes breaks. You know, he gets his brow wiped and he gets a sip of water and he wipes the blood from his eyes. And then what does he do? He goes back in the ring. And that's what we are doing. We're all looking to find tools that enable us to get back out in there and be able to keep at it. It's messy. It's not going to stop being messy, at least for, you know, this is, you know, we those of us who have wanted and desired and have signed up for incarnating here on this planet, you know, we've signed up for the duration of the war. And so it's going to go as long as it goes. And, you know, who knows what that will be. But whatever it is, we're always, whether we're cavemen, you know, way back when, or we're in our next 2 lifetimes and we're living in strange houses because the ozone layer is depleted, I don't know. Whatever it is, it's incumbent upon us to find the tools to keep us back in the game. Not withdrawing from the game in all the ways that we can withdraw through isolation, through staying, you know, separate from people, through whatever means that we use. Through suicide, there's another way to withdraw. But withdrawal gets us nothing. And when we choose our next life, we may choose a scenario that doesn't allow us to withdraw, particularly if that's what we're predisposed to doing. So when you see people who are trapped, they got 6 kids, the husband dies, and they're stuck in a house, they got no way out, the soul probably set that up so that they wouldn't just keep running and withdrawing in whatever way that they do. They wanted to stay and feel it and experience it and really be there, present with all of the messiness. Now that takes courage. That's what we're wanting to develop, is courage to do just that.
So really one of the morals of the teachings here is that no matter how hard you think it is now, if you don't go through it, it's going to be harder the next time.
Particularly if we're wanting to be on the fast track. You know, we're wanting to be able to and learn how to deal with the messiness. And we know that because when you look at all the masters that have come before us, they are in the most quintessential difficulties. They didn't avoid them. I'm signing up for it, you know. And there's so many different things to sign up for. There's so many different ways of dealing with and facing wrongdoing. But attempting to avoid wrongdoing doesn't work.
Lisette Larkins, from extremely unusual encounters with extraterrestrial presences, all the way to dealing with difficult people who don't like it when you tell them about encounters with extraterrestrial presences. Lisette, thank you so much.
My pleasure, really. Thank you.